Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 13th, 2012, and my guest is Paul Tough. His latest book is How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. Paul, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks. Great to be here.
You open your book by saying we've been looking for results in the wrong places. By results, childhood success, fighting poverty, helping kids escape poverty and get education. What do you mean we're looking in the wrong places?
Well, I think that for the last couple of decades especially, we have been overemphasizing the importance of IQ and cognitive skills when we think about what helps children succeed. I think that's why we're so obsessed with test scores, both in terms of individual families and as a nation in terms of our education policy. And the researchers and educators who I write about in the book are arguing for a different set of skills being at least as predictive of success for kids and arguably more predictive.
And you start off the book talking about some recent results in neuroscience and psychology, and I have to confess, it's a fabulous book. It's one of the most provocative books I've read on education and poverty in a long, long time. But the opening of the book I had a little trouble with. You talk about recent results in neuroscience and psychology. Let's talk about those. What role do you think we understand what relationship do you think we understand between parental attachment and success in children as they grow older?
Well, I think we are learning that there's a very strong relationship between parental attachment and later success. And for me, the book, the study that was made a big impact on me in terms of understanding that was this study that came out of the University of Minnesota by these two psychologists, Alan Srofe and Byron Egeland. And they studied a group of kids for many years, doing attachment measures on them and their parents from actually before birth, getting a sense of the home environment, and then continuing on through adulthood. And they draw what, for me, are pretty persuasive connections between early attachment and not just mental health and happiness, which I think has been demonstrated pretty well in other studies, but also long-term economic effects, things like how likely kids are to graduate from high school.
And how is parental attachment measured, and what do you mean by that? What do the scientists mean by that?
Yeah, so it's a good question because I think parental attachment is something that sort of means different things to different people. I think there's sort of just a common usage of just being close with a close relationship between parents and children. I think there's also this new, there's the super attachment idea, like the mom on the cover of Time magazine nursing her 4-year-old. That's this movement toward really intensive attachment between parents and children. But that's not what I'm talking about, or what these scientists at the University of Minnesota are talking about. Attachment as a theory, as an idea in psychology, dates back to the post-war period, I think the 50s and the 60s, when these two psychologists started studying the relationship between parents and children in the first couple of years of life. And the way that you measure attachment, the main way, is this pretty strange test called the strange situation, where at age, I think they do it both at 12 months and 18 months, in a lab setting set up to look like a playroom, an infant and his or her mother play together for a while, and then the mother leaves for a while. And sometimes the child is just on his own. Sometimes he's with a stranger. And then after a few minutes, the parent comes back. And the important what the psychologists measure in terms of judging attachment is not what the child does when the parent leaves, because some kids get antsy and some kids are calm about that. It's the reaction that they have when the parent returns. And if the child is attached and connected and embraces the parent or is happy to see him or her, that is an indication of secure attachment. And the numbers are that 60% of children in the United States are securely attached. So it's not some sort of like elite group of super secure kids. Most kids are securely attached. The other 40% are anxiously attached. There are different subcategories in anxious attachment, and different types of anxious attachment tend to lead to different sorts of psychological and other problems down the road.
Yeah, I'm kind of skeptical of those kind of results, mainly because it's hard to measure those things with precision, and it's hard to control for all the other factors. And I know they do their best. They try to. Brian Kaplan at George Mason University has an argument, and I've interviewed him on this program, where he argues that parenting is relatively unimportant, and that twin studies bear that out. That twins tend to, when they're raised separately, they tend to turn out quite similar. What is your reaction, or the scientists' reaction to those kind of results?
So they take them on pretty firmly. The book that I would recommend to anyone who's interested in this is by Sroufe and Egeland and others, and it's called The Development of the Person. And they're definitely sensitive to those charges. They were writing, in the aftermath of Steven Pinker and Judith Rich Harris and others who talked about the small importance of parenting. And there was I did dig pretty deeply into this research and was contemplating writing about it in the book, but decided not to, because I felt like I felt pretty convinced by the attachment research, and I felt like it wasn't an argument that I wanted to go through, because it takes a long time to go through it.
Yeah, sure.
But I do think it's really important and really interesting. But I tend to fall on the side of the attachment guys rather than Kaplan and Harris and Pinker. And so the research actually that I think that came out after the nurture assumption, that I think is really important, and that my sense is has not been addressed by the people who make that argument, is by this guy Eric Turkheimer. And what he found that makes a lot of sense to me is that how much your genes matter actually depends on your environment. So for kids who are in a really positive environment, a safe, stable environment, genetic IQ genetics actually do make a difference in terms of IQ and other results, because they don't, their environment is not having any kind of negative effect on them. For kids who are in negative environments, for low-income kids, the environment makes a huge difference. So to me, I think that's part of the dispute, and that it may be actually more kind of a confusion than a dispute. For people like me who are really interested in what's going on with kids at the bottom, I think there's tons of evidence that the environment and parents make a huge, huge difference. For people who are worried about like what little additional parental behaviors or activities they can do to get their kid to, Harvard instead of Princeton, absolutely, it doesn't. There is not strong evidence that those sorts of small parental behaviors make a difference, and genes really do matter.
I'm pretty agnostic on it. I think parenting matters a lot for a lot of things. I just wonder about the two extremes of that literature. I think they're often grinding their own axe and kind of oblivious to the other sides. But let's move on to to me, really what's the most provocative part of the book, which is the last 80%, which is phenomenal. You start off talking about conscientiousness. What does that term in psychology mean? Why is it important, and how important is it relative to cognitive ability?
So conscientiousness, yes, it's a word that we all use to mean something, and then there's also an official psychological category, and the two overlap a lot. It involves self-control. It involves things like punctuality. I think there's a certain amount of empathy to it, being concerned about others. But it's mostly pretty similar to self-control, self-regulation, being able to control your impulses. A delay of gratification is part of it, and it is highly predictive of positive outcomes. And in terms of psychological traits, it is the most predictive, I think, of positive outcomes of all kinds. I mean, certainly, the more it's especially a good thing to have in terms of things like getting through a lot of school, having a high salary, staying married. All of those things are highly correlated with
staying out of jail.
Yeah,
important things. Is it? How much of it is what you call grit, which is to me the everyday word that I, as a teacher, a parent, observer of life, I see the importance of grit all the time. I think when you're younger, your SAT score, your grade point seems like the way we determine hierarchy, because that's the only stuff you got. As you get older, you realize those things don't count so much. They matter, but grit can go a long way.
It sure can. So I think they're different in a way that I think is really interesting. They're certainly related, certainly connected. But the work, the scholar who I sort of followed through both the conscientiousness literature and the idea of grit is this woman, Angela Duckworth, a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And she started out her scholarly career studying self-control, which again is quite similar to conscientiousness. And she found that in one famous study, or famous in this world, she found that if you take middle school kids and at the beginning of the year you give them a measure of IQ and a measure of self-control, that self-control better predicts their GPA at the end of the year than their IQ. So IQ helps a lot in terms of standardized tests. Conscientiousness and self-control help a lot in terms of GPA, because you're the kind of person who does your homework and studies for your tests and things like that.
And you could argue, that's not very. You could argue that's not very important, right? Grades are measuring this weird ability. In a way, grades are conscientiousness measures in a certain obvious way. If you don't do your homework, sometimes that literally counts toward your grade, and so it's not just that you don't prepare well for the test if you don't do your homework. So that's not so surprising. I think the more important thing is the later results, right, in life.
Yeah, exactly. That it makes a big difference way down the road as well. That the conscientiousness effect continues into adulthood. So anyway, Angela Duckworth became this sort of guru of self-control for a couple of years, and then I think started to feel like it wasn't measuring all of the elements of success that she wanted. There's something about self-control that's just, it's a little bit narrow and constricting. It's just about following rules and doing what's right, and, it's like the classic square kind of mentality. And that those people are not the ones who go on and, start bands and invent Apple and computer and things like that. And so grit was this idea that she came up with. It was it certainly involved a lot of self-discipline, but also involved a large degree of passion. She defines it as passion in pursuit of perseverance in pursuit of a passion. So it's somebody who has a very strong goal and does not let obstacles get in the way, does not give up, does not get distracted. And so she now feels like grit is the more important and more predictive of these non-cognitive skills.
One other example that you use in the book that I want to let you talk about, and then we'll talk about what the implications of these results are. You give this utterly fascinating example of rewarding kids for doing well on an IQ test versus not. Talk about how giving kids M&Ms for right answers changed their IQ scores.
It's a very strange test, and the relationship between that test and the conscientiousness literature, I think, is a little complicated. So this was two experiments that were done back in the 1970s, where they were trying to study motivation. They took some kids and gave them IQ tests, right, which you're not supposed to be able to study for. They're supposed to be this sort of pure measure of IQ. And the motivation they gave was the simplest, most straightforward thing ever, which is they gave these kids an M&M for each right answer that they had. And the kids' IQ scores jumped by like 10 points. And so that's interesting, and I think what it suggests is that a lot of kids don't try hard on IQ tests, right? I don't think anyone would argue that M&Ms actually increase IQ, but they would argue that some kids don't care about IQ tests, and why should they? And so they don't really try, and if they try a little bit, they do a lot better. The stuff that I find so interesting about those sorts of tests is that when you do both in that M&M test and in later similar tests. When you there are some kids. So if you give them a test like that with no incentives, and then you give them a test like that with incentives, some kids will have that 10-point jump, but some kids won't. And the kids who don't have that jump mostly don't have that jump not because they don't like M&Ms, but because they were already trying hard. And
just for the sake of trying hard.
Exactly. You put a test in front of them. They're like, all right, I'll do my best, and that is conscientiousness. Those are the kids who score high in conscientiousness. And it's those kids who aren't swayed by M&Ms who actually do better in life. So yeah, it makes the M&M experiment kind of complicated because on the one hand, it seems like there's this great thing that we can change kids' IQ. And I think it does tell us something about incentives and motivation and the fact that we're sort of leaving a lot of IQ points on the table in a lot of classrooms that if we could find a good way to motivate kids that is a little more sophisticated than M&Ms, they could really do a lot better. But at the same time, it still suggests that for kids who need that kind of external motivation, they've got that's still a problem because they don't have this other skill that's going to really help them in life.
Well, my memory of your result was it was actually more than 10 points. It was 18, which is a huge jump in IQ. It was 79 to 97, at least in one of the studies that you report.
You're right. Yep.
And the incredible thing, as an author, I know everybody knows your book better than you do. It's just the way it goes.
Exactly.
Don't be embarrassed.
A long time ago.
But what I found fascinating, and I thought this was really a totally non-obvious and incredibly useful insight, is that if you had to choose between the 79 or the 97, I think most people would say, well, the 97's the better measure of IQ because that's the one where they were trying. And of course, that means there really are 97s. You can't call them a 79.
Right.
But maybe the 79 is the right measure to use because that captures the fact that if they're not highly motivated, they just don't try.
Right.
And the people who there are a lot of things in life that don't get incentivized. You just, you either do them well or you don't.
Right. And I think, I do think that it's true that 97 is their real IQ, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I think it also says that IQ is not everything. IQ doesn't matter as much as we think it does, and arguably as much as conscientiousness. So to me, it really suggests that, in some ways that I feel sets us off down the path of the whole book. That if we could find a way to teach not just to help kids do better on that one test, but to teach conscientiousness,
waste of time,
to help kids develop a grit and self-control, then they've already got the intelligence. These are kids who are doing really terribly in school, and they don't see the long-term incentives, even though they're there. If they were getting a 97, they'd make lots of money down the road, but they can't see those incentives down the road. If we could connect them to those incentives, make them think, make them understand how these long-term payoffs are really going to help them, they've already got the IQ to do well in school.
So that was my next question, which is, I think most people understand and agree that grit, conscientiousness, self-control, delaying gratification, these are all things that help a person become more successful in life. And anybody who has children thinks about this, or at least anybody who's read the literature like you have and I've dabbled in, understands that these things are important. It's not obvious that you can do anything about it. So where do you think we stand on that question? How can we, if at all, increase grit, conscientiousness, and these characteristics that do help people later on in life?
I think there's some pretty strong evidence that we can change these things, but I think you're absolutely right that we don't yet know how. And so in my book, part of what I'm doing is trying to point people towards some experimental evidence, or some, particularly innovative educators who I think are developing these skills. But absolutely, we don't yet have a curriculum or a real methodology that's going to say, here's how you boost conscientiousness scores. I do feel like for kids who are struggling in school, and especially for kids in high poverty neighborhoods, I do think that giving them talking with them about the importance of these character strengths, giving them a clear sense of how hard work and conscientiousness now is going to lead to clear payoffs later in a language and a context that makes sense to them, can have an enormous effect. In some ways, I think it's exactly why all of these high-performing charter schools, from KIPP to all of the ones in the same mold, it's exactly why they're so successful. They just get these kids to become incredibly conscientious and to work really hard. And they do it by being really good at motivating them. And partly that has to do with, the sense of group identity and just all the kind of fun it is to be a KIPP student. Exactly. But I think it's also about, very like on the walls of KIPP, there are posters explaining, the economic data about how much your salary will increase if you get a BA. And I think that's a pretty abstract concept to most kids. But I think it's pretty compelling when you look at the numbers.
Do they believe it?
I think they do. I mean, I think
a lot of things that we tell kids, they just. And you remember you were a kid once. I just don't believe them.
Right. I think that alone. I think if you go into a classroom and say, "Okay, here's the data. You get a BA. Here's what you're going to make. You don't. Here's what you're going to make." That's probably not going to do it. But I think in the context of these more powerful motivation techniques that KIPP uses, this group identity and wall-to-wall messaging, I think that message is also really powerful, and that without it, I think that all of that other stuff becomes kind of empty. If you can say to kids, this will lead to real success, and you can do it, and other people like you can do it, that is not something you hear a lot, and not something you see evidence of a lot when you're growing up in a high poverty neighborhood. And seeing that evidence and hearing that message, I think, is really powerful.
So in my house, I have 4 kids. We basically don't watch television during the week at all. We don't have cable because my 3 boys will watch intramural volleyball competition between Division III athletic managers. I mean, they will watch anything competitive that's sports related, right?
ESPN 7.
Correct. ESPN, right? Yeah. Exactly. They'd like the all ESPN cable package. So because of ESPN, and I have a similar disease, so both for myself and for them, we don't have the cable package. We don't have ESPN. Today is Thursday. We will not be watching the Bears-Packers, which I'm sure we would some subset of us, or if not all of us, would watch some, if not all of, if we had access to it. And they're not going to be going to a bar to watch it. So, I've restricted them from that. I worry that has not made them more conscientious. It's made them more excited to go off to college where they can watch ESPN 27 hours a day. Do we think there's anything there that in terms of long-run effect? Or is it, I think it's just the way it is. Isn't a huge part of this just genetic? I mean, you look at kids, anybody who has more than one kid knows there's a variance in grit, conscientiousness, competitiveness, which is another aspect of this that you don't talk about in the book. But I think some people try hard on IQ tests because they want a high number. It makes them feel good. The way they like a high score in anything. Do you think that my kids? Tell me how I'm doing.
I think some of it is, sure. There are some kids who are, I think, some people who are more naturally conscientious, more naturally competitive, more naturally, sensation-seeking or pleasure-seeking, and all of that stuff has a big impact on who you are and how you go through life. People cannot be, Pinker's right. There is not a blank slate. You can't mold people, absolutely. But I think that you can change. People can change. I mean, people change all the time. Kids in middle school are not necessarily the way they are when they become adults. And I think that one of the things that I'm persuaded by is the mindset research. This idea that can sound kind of touchy-feely, but I think has pretty strong evidence behind it. That when kids believe that they can change their intelligence, they actually do better. They work harder. In some ways, I think that's similar to what we were just talking about, the message that you can actually succeed if you go to college. It's just not I think for a lot of middle school students especially, they hear the message that they're never going to change, and they believe it. And so I think there is something positive about giving kids the message that they can change. The other thing that I'd say, and this is maybe a little bit outside the realm of science and slightly more in the realm of anecdote. Angela Duckworth talks in, I think, really interesting way about the word habit. She quotes William James as saying that basically character is just a fancy word for your habits. And she thinks that's a really positive thing to say to kids, because when you talk about character, often kids think, the character is something that's fixed and can't change. But habits, like you can change your habits, right? If you bite your nails, you can stop biting your nails. It's hard, but you can do it. And I think in lots of ways, that's what's going on with you and your family and ESPN. Like there is something I think there's something. I think it's a positive thing. Like it's a positive thing for kids. Say like, we're not going to get in the habit of doing this. We're going to restrict ourselves from doing this. I think it just gets them out of the habit of like every day I come home and I watch sports, which I think is a useful pattern to have in your head. And partly I think it gives them a lesson in conscientiousness, like, oh, I can actually choose to deprive myself of something. And of course, they're in the moment they're going to complain and feel incredibly wounded by it. But I think that practice of like, oh, I'm delaying gratification. I'm putting something off. I'm denying myself of something for a reason. That's all good stuff to practice. It doesn't mean that people are going to be, perfectly conscientious when they go through life, but I think it's a positive thing.
Yeah, Israel Salanter, 19th century rabbi who started what's called the Musar movement in Judaism, which is about character improvement. I think he would agree that character and habit are interrelated, but he also said that it's easier to learn the Talmud than to change a habit. Learning the Talmud's very hard. He meant the whole thing. He didn't mean sampling it. And I think every adult who's, when I look back at the habits I've broken, the few, and the things I've improved on, or that at least I wanted to improve, whether they're actually improvements, I don't know, but things have changed. It's not obvious what the mechanism is that made those things happen. And I think it points to your point about we don't know how to do it. There are some people who can do it. There are people who inspire, but it's not a science.
It's definitely not a science. But I mean, and this is all just kind of levels of matters of degree. But I tend to think that people can change themselves pretty well. Like I think there is. I think about my own life. I think about the people around me. There are certainly patterns that people get into that are very hard to break. But at the same time, I feel like I don't know anyone who doesn't have in their life a habit that they've broken or a pattern that they've changed. And it takes work and it takes reflection and it takes a little sacrifice. But I think people change all the time.
As Mark Twain said, it's easy to quit smoking. I've done it a score of times. Changing habits for a while is relatively easy. It's changing them for good is, I think, dramatically harder, and we don't know that much about it.
You're right. But at the same time, I mean, like a lot of people have quit smoking in the United States in the past 20 or 30 years. I did it once. And I think there are other habits that people change in terms of like in society. Like we all wear seatbelts now. We do sometimes get into habits, and the big ones are harder to change than the little ones. But I think there's something about the little ones that can be somewhat inspiring.
So the implication of that is that change and improvement comes at a very personal level, and less at a top-down societal level. The implication is there's a strong role for personal responsibility to play in making each of us and the world a better place. Are you comfortable with that?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think anyone can change without I don't think you can change anybody else. Absolutely. But at the same time, I think in the context we're talking about, which is for me about parenting and about education, I think that it is also important to look at the evidence that adults can help children change, absolutely. And that a lot of this, very sort of personal, psychological transformation that can happens for kids anyway, and usually happens in relationship with adults. So whether it's a parent or a sports coach or a teacher or a mentor, when kids make changes, certainly for the better, but arguably also for the worse, it's usually not under the influence. I mean, not just because a parent is telling them what to do, but in a relationship with an adult, they are getting somehow motivated to change. I think it's very hard if you're a kid to just change your life on your own. Some kids actually do it, and that's always kind of amazing to watch. But usually, it's in this kind of relationship, and I think, and so I think that especially for kids who are living in adversity, coming from high poverty neighborhoods, it's one of the things that I think is important to think about in terms of when we start thinking about the public policy implications of this. Because when I've seen them change. And I think there's some experimental evidence of this, but I think it's mostly my sense of it is just through the reporting I've done, what I've watched myself. I think that, I think it's always done through sort of close relationships. It's the reason that I get so anxious about these like credit recovery programs for the kids in these schools where they fall behind on their credits and they end up going into a classroom where there's just a bunch of other kids all staring at computer screens, clicking a mouse, like answering quiz after quiz, and then someone, in Arkansas says that they've completed ninth grade geography or something, right? And so I'm skeptical about that for lots of reasons in terms of actually content. But I'm really skeptical about it because I feel like what those kids need, and if they're the sort of kids who can't complete American history in the class, what they need is a connection with a teacher, right? And so finding ways to do that, I think, can be a little bit complicated. But I think there's lots of evidence that it's exactly what those kids need. Yeah,
and one of the it's an interesting thing is a lot of excitement, and I'm excited about it also about online education efforts that can improve the educational process. But as you point out in the book, schools are about a lot more, and growing up is about a lot more than conveying and understanding information, which is a lot of times what a computer screen is good at. You might get some understanding and knowledge, something a little deeper than information, but those intangible things you're talking about aren't going to be there.
Right, and I get excited about that kind of online education as well, but I think it's clear that stuff works best if you've already got conscientiousness,
Yeah, for sure.
And so, there's already this kind of conscientiousness gap if education continues to move in that direction. I just worry that it's going to increase that gap.
Now, in the old days, people used to argue that one of the virtues of sports was that it builds character, and I think they meant that word in a very rich way. How you treat others, dealing with success. And you don't talk about sports in your book, but you do talk about chess. You could call it a sport. Yep. It's definitely a competitive activity. It's not aerobic most of the time. But talk about what you learned. It's an extraordinary set of stories in the book about some chess programs in America.
Sure. So I just want to talk first about sports. And I absolutely take your point that sports coaches are one of the groups of people who I think do this better than anybody. I give people the motivation to change and give them a clear set of tools to develop these character strengths. I think it happens all the time. And so I happen to pick chess instead of football because I found this chess teacher I wanted to write about, but also because I think that even when we think that this is true for, that sports builds character, we think of it, it's a physical activity, right? The fact that you can also do this, that this is also happening in something like chess that we think of as the ultimate intellectual ability, I think is also really telling. So the chess team that I followed is the intermediate school 318 team in Brooklyn, a middle school team. And right now, when you look at chess results at any national competition, the kids who mostly win chess tournaments are rich kids from exclusive private schools, kids from competitive exam schools, or kids from parochial schools. And that's true in every grade except the middle school grades, and for the last few years, and that's because IS 318 wins everything every year. And this past spring, they actually, after my reporting was done, they won the National High School Championship for the first time, which is quite remarkable considering that none of them are in high school yet. So they're really good chess players. And so I set out a few years ago, just when they were at the beginning of their winning streak, to try to figure out what was going on. And my first instinct was that there was some trick, that this was somehow a selective school that was getting all the smartest kids from all over the city. But it's not. It's a pretty regular New York City public school with a pretty big majority low-income population. And the kids who excel at chess are not necessarily the quote-unquote smartest kids in the school, and when you look at their standardized test scores. So I think that what's happening is that they are using these other skills, these non-cognitive skills or character strengths. And I think that is because of their teacher, this woman named Elizabeth Spiegel, who is a great, great teacher. And I think will remind some people of, football coaches because she has that same sort of gruffness and intensity and sort of, I think, a combination of caring very much about the kids and wanting them to succeed, but also not babying them.
Yeah. She reminded me of my 8th grade teacher, Miss Canine, at Muzzy Junior High in Lexington. If anybody out there knows what happened to Miss Canine, she was a life changer for a lot for me and lots of students, because she didn't coddle us, and she used the full grading scale. F wasn't low enough for her. You could get an M, you could get an M minus, and you could get multiple A pluses. You get an A quadruple plus, but she needed more range. But anyway, just thought I'd get in a plug for Miss Canine. But yeah, tell us more about her. And
Sure. So what the thing that I came to conclude about her teaching style was that it came down to this one particular ritual that they have, which is after every game at a tournament or even in the classroom, if win or lose, you have to sit down with Ms. Spiegel and go through your whole game, move by
phenomenal
move.
Scene in the book.
And she, so I would sit there in some of these, and these are middle school kids, they're pretty, like tiny kids with enormous backpacks. And so I was expecting, especially when kids lost, that she would be sort of like, oh,
Good job.
You tried hard, you did your best, it's just a game.
Yeah.
There's another one coming up. And she's mean. Like, she really is tough on these kids. And she'd be like, why would you make that move? How long did you take to think about that one? That was a terrible move. If you're going to play like that, you can just go home. Just saying, really mean things to these kids, but not just picking on them, not belittling them, not trying to make them. Maybe trying to make them feel bad, but in a temporary kind of way. And to my surprise, the kids loved it, and I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. I think I had sort of taken the lessons of self-esteem to heart. That, like, if you can wound a kid's self-esteem, and it's going to be incredibly damaging. But of course, right? All athletes can tell you this who've had a great coach. All musicians who've had a great teacher can tell you this. What you want more than anybody is a teacher who is paying close attention to your strengths and your weaknesses, and not letting you get away with mistakes, and pushing you to improve yourself. And in chess, that is exactly what kids need to succeed. This kind of repeated feedback.
Not just chess.
Oh, exactly. Not
everything.
Just chess. You
need the feedback, and you need to fail. Right. You need to play people better than you, not just win every time. And
absolutely. But in chess, I think what's remarkable about it is how fast you can improve. And I think that's true. And I absolutely agree that these methods work for everything. But chess, just because the feedback loop is so fast, you lose your game. You sit down with Miss Spiegel. She goes over exactly what mistakes you made and what you could have done differently. And then you got another game in half an hour, and you do that 7 times in a weekend. That is an incredibly effective way to learn things. And I think that it's that if that part of it wasn't there, her actually getting them to look very honestly at their mistakes, analyze them, figure out what they could have done differently. I don't think it would happen. I think kids would just get stuck in a rut and they'd stay at the same rating level. But kids' ratings shoot up all the time on this team.
Yeah, I think it's another point where I think relevant for the discussion of online education. We don't like to admit it, but some great teachers are great because they have a unique ability to motivate an individual to want to please them. It's an external motivation that's become frowned on by Alfie Kohn and others who suggest that that's not going to last. And yet I think it helps build the habits that we're talking about. And amazing scene in that book when after a success, she cries out of joy, because that's part of teaching too. It's not just the student who has that relationship. A great teacher is deeply rewarded when they see their students learn and get up off that floor and succeed.
Right, and I think it's telling that what made her cry was not the kid who won the whole championship, who was the best player on the team. It was the kid who A had improved the most, and B who she had helped improve. That she could see him learning things and using things on the chessboard that she herself had talked to him about.
Yeah,
that's got to be an amazingly satisfying thing for a teacher.
Incredible story. Before we leave this section, I'm just going to mention that there's a poem by James Dickey. We'll put a link up to it. That captures this idea of grit and coaching and inspiration and parenting. It's called The Bee, B-E-E, and it's dedicated to the football coaches of Clemson College, 1942. If you're interested out there in that poem, if you like poetry, it's a beautiful poem.
Great.
And it captures some of this. Let's move on to the public policy issues. I found out about your work from a New York Times Sunday Magazine article you had a few weeks back. Mm-hmm. I think it was called Obama versus Poverty or Obama and Poverty. Versus. And let's start with how you opened that piece with President Obama, or at least it's a story in the piece about President Obama when he campaigned in the Chicago neighborhood of Roseland. What happened after he became president? What did he talk about when he was there, and what happened afterward?
Just to clarify one thing, so I don't think he ever actually campaigned in Roseland. He was in Roseland in the 80s as a community organizer.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But the campaign speech I was talking about was in 2007 in Anacostia, which is a Roseland-like neighborhood.
Okay, a different bad neighborhood. But he was talking about this tragic situation in America where there are neighborhoods that appear to be neighborhoods of hopelessness, and poverty didn't always equal hopelessness. It just used to mean sometimes, at least, you didn't make as much money as some other folks, but you had a different kind of life, of course, but you didn't have despair. And this is about despair. So talk about his campaign and then what happened.
Sure. So I've been writing about poverty for a while now, and I'm very influenced by the writing of William Julius Wilson, the sociologist from the University of Chicago, who talks about neighborhood effects and especially the effect of concentrated poverty, and how in the 1960s and especially the 1970s, poverty concentrated in American cities in a way that it hadn't ever before in American history, and that had devastating effects on the people who lived there, on the neighborhoods themselves, and I would say especially on the children who grew up there. And so President Obama spent pre-President Obama, young man Obama spent some key formative years in one of those neighborhoods, Roseland, in Chicago, at a particularly, and I hadn't realized this until I went back and looked at other literature from that period. It was just this period in the late 80s in Chicago where things were just falling apart at an incredible rate. That was partly, I think, to do with crack coming into those neighborhoods. Yeah. This was just when Mayor Washington died. But I think lots of people, I think, who were writing about it at the time just felt like, especially in 1987, that's the year that Obama mentions, things just felt like they were going off the rails in those neighborhoods in a way that they hadn't before. And so I think that he was, as I am, I think he was influenced by both his observation of those neighborhoods of concentrated poverty and the literature around concentrated poverty, and felt like a lot of us do, which is it is a public policy problem that we do not have answers for. I think Charles Murray makes a really good case in Losing Ground that the traditional liberal approach to concentrated poverty in those neighborhoods did not work during that era, and arguably cannot work. But I also think that the solutions that he suggested and that other conservatives suggested haven't worked either. I think none of us know what to do for those neighborhoods. And so, in that speech that he gave that Obama gave in 2007 in Anacostia, a few months after he announced his presidential campaign, he talked about his experience of being in Roseland, and he talked about the experience of living in those neighborhoods of concentrated poverty the way that I think is very rare. Maybe it's never happened before that a presidential candidate would talk about this research.
Talk about a log cabin, but they don't.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so. Part of the reason that presidential candidates don't talk about it is that it's very rare for them to have had the kind of experience that he did. And the other reason is because it's a place that if you're talking about public policy, it's a scary topic to get to because we don't, yet quite know what works. So he proposed some things that I think and thought and think were really important, including most significantly this idea of promised neighborhoods, this idea of expanding the Harlem Children's Zone, which is what I wrote my first book on, and replicating it in other cities around the country.
What is the Harlem Children's Zone? What's distinctive about it?
So the Harlem Children's Zone is quite distinctive. It is a 97-block neighborhood in central Harlem, and this man, Jeffrey Canada, has built this nonprofit organization, mostly with philanthropic money, that tries to help every kid in that neighborhood to succeed. And by succeed, he means graduate from college, or at least have the opportunity to graduate from college. And he does that by starting from the premise that is also, I think, William Julius Wilson's present premise and Senator Obama's premise, that the lives of kids in those neighborhoods are so complexly bad, not just sort of straightforwardly bad, that it doesn't make any sense to try to fix just one thing in their lives, just fix their healthcare, just fix
make
their
the school
housing,
better,
just fix their education, and ignore everything else. And so he set out to try to plug all the holes in the safety net for those kids. He started a few charter schools, more or less modeled after the KIPP schools. But he also provides early childhood education, parenting, a farmer's market, a health clinic, to try to address all of the needs that these kids have. And it's a hard intervention to measure scientifically, but my sense is that he's had very positive results. And so the idea of Promised Neighborhoods was to do a public-private partnerships like that, or public philanthropic partnerships like that in 20 cities across the country.
And what happened?
Well, it did good. We do now have a Promised Neighborhood program. There are several cities that have received, or quite a few cities that have received $500,000 planning grants from the Department of Education to apply for an implementation grant to start a Promised Neighborhood. And there are, I think, 3 cities that have actually received implementation grants of $10 million or so. And I visited some of these Promised Neighborhoods, and
they're promising.
A lot of them are doing, they are promising. But they're, the budget of the Harlem Children's Zone is, I think, something like $80 million a year. And what President Obama talked about was spending billions of dollars a year. And that's a tough thing to talk about, A, in an election campaign, and B, at a moment of economic crisis. But I think you can really make the case that in order to make that sort of transformative change, you've got to spend that kind of money. And absolutely, he's not. He's spending about 1% of what he said he would spend.
So for me, there wasn't anything novel in the fact that a politician didn't keep his promise. That's dog bites man. What I found the thought provoker of your story was the realization, at least among some, maybe I don't think the president, but maybe not, who knows, but the realization among some that maybe spending billions really wasn't the solution anyway. So it wasn't that he hadn't followed through and kept his idealistic promise. It's that idealism is not maybe so well-founded in reality, that the government can step in and spend that amount of money and transform those lives. I mean, we've been trying that approach for 50 years now. It hasn't worked.
I mean, I would be more susceptible to that argument if it had been tried and failed. I don't think that it was a case of Obama having some kind of realization that, this isn't going to work.
No, I'm talking about your realization, actually.
My realization.
That it's more complicated than
I know,
it looks.
But I'm not sure I have come to that realization. Okay. I mean, I still think Promised Neighborhoods is a really good idea, because I think, and so you're right. I do say at the end of the article that it is some of the problems that exist in these neighborhoods may be beyond the reach of any government to really deal with. But I think we actually haven't tried enough. We have spent lots of money, and the case I would make is we still do spend lots of money in these neighborhoods. I mean, the government is intensely involved in neighborhoods, but mostly in pretty negative ways and pretty unproductive ways. And so I think that my vision for Promised Neighborhoods, which I think is still pretty connected to Obama's 2007 vision for Promised Neighborhoods, is that it doesn't have to be about spending more money. And I do take a lot of Charles Murray's points about the spending that went on in the 60s and 70s and how a lot of it was very counterproductive. But I think that was more about the way the money was spent than that it was spent at all. And I think a lot of conservatives have taken from him just the idea that, like, do not spend any money on poor people, is just going to go to waste. And so I think, and I think what Jeffrey Canada does is he's much more sensible about how to spend money in low-income neighborhoods than the war on poverty folks were 20, 30 years earlier. And I think part of the reason is because he's part of he's running a nonprofit. He's the CEO. He thinks differently than a government bureaucrat. And that was another thing that I was and I am excited about when it comes to Promised Neighborhoods, that these were going to be these public-private partnerships that were not going to be about, Washington bureaucrats deciding on how the money gets spent. So I'm still hopeful, or at least I'm still optimistic about it. I'm not necessarily optimistic that we'll ever spend the money, but I'm optimistic that it could make a big difference if we spent money more sensibly in those neighborhoods. I may be wrong. It may simply be that it is we don't think that this is what governments should do. Governments can't do it. The problem is, if that's true, like, I don't know what the solution is, because I don't think that anyone else has a good solution to those problems, and they do keep getting worse. I mean, some things are getting better. Crime is better in many cities, in inner cities, than it was. But I think in terms of like family dysfunction, things continue to get worse. In terms of educational results, things continue to get worse. The kind of American ideal of equality of opportunity simply doesn't exist for millions and millions of kids in those neighborhoods.
It's a terrible tragedy, but I think your book points to the solution. Maybe it's not the one you like, and maybe I'm overreading it, but your book highlights some extraordinary individuals, people who care, people with lots of grit, trying to help others find grit, find a rock to hold on to in a very bad stream that they're being swept along by.
Yeah.
And we know it works, but it's not one thing. What works is letting a bunch of individuals creatively create their own organizations in a civil society voluntarily, collecting money from people voluntarily, and let those people blossom and bloom. And the more government tries to solve that problem with your dollars and mine, the less incentive people have to create those organizations and the less incentive we have to give to them. Mm-hmm. So I think, to me, I'm an emergent Hayekian, classical liberal, limited government kind of guy. Don't you think the lesson is we got to get the government out of the poverty business and let these other things emerge, and the best ones will thrive and the worst ones will fall away?
I hear where you're coming from, but I don't think that the money is there. I don't think it's like there's not a market economy in helping poor people. You know what I mean?
Yes.
There's a philanthropic economy.
There's no profit to be made. There's no monetary profit, but there's emotional profit. And
sure.
Nothing is worse than conflating voluntary activity with business, right? Business is one thing we do voluntarily, but those organizations you're talking about, those nonprofits, which is just a word to mean, it's just a tax term, right? It's people striving to help other people, and if they succeed, they can raise more money. If they don't, they fail. And if they get the rewards of seeing that satisfaction occur, and if they don't do it, they're not going to get the satisfaction, and they're going to do something else.
Sure. Well, so I would say there's two places I take your point, but there's two places I differ with you. One is that I actually think that this is one of the roles of government, is to help poor people. That government is going to continue to help poor people. It's just a question of whether they do it in a smart, efficient way that increases opportunity or not. And I think that unless we push the government towards being more smart and efficient in terms of focusing on improving opportunity for children rather than anything else, they won't do those things. Government won't do those things, and those kids won't have an opportunity to do better. The other thing is that, I take your point, philanthropy is a great way of helping people. The reason that the Harlem Children's Zone works is that it has $80 million a year, and that's just not going to happen in Detroit and Cleveland and Youngstown, Ohio, because there is not – Jeff has like 4 billionaires on his board.
Sure.
And he's able to get $80 million a year out of them.
Thank God there's a bunch of billionaires.
Yeah, thank God.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But there are a lot more billionaires in Manhattan than there are in these other cities. And Jeff is really good at connecting with billionaires in a way that every philanthropist is not. His great combination of skills is that he cares intensely about kids, and he is a fantastic fundraiser.
Oh, I agree. You need both.
And there just aren't like Elizabeth Spiegel is fantastic at connecting with kids too as a chess coach. She is not necessarily a fantastic fundraiser, and so I don't think that the $80 million is gonna follow every good idea.
I agree with that. Although I'd like to see Jeff start some franchises, and maybe that's his next move. But I'm sure his time is scarce. He's a busy guy, and he's having enough trouble just keeping his own thing in Harlem going.
Right. And that is exactly what Promised Neighborhoods was supposed to be, is franchises. And so it's a slightly different vision of franchise than what you're describing, because it is, franchise with the government's involvement. But I think there's a model there in that public-private partnership that could really work. Well,
I think it's wrong to think the amount of money is the key. I think you got to have some resources, but I think the biggest mistake we've made in anti-poverty and in education is assuming that more money means more results. We know that's not true. So it has to be true that it's how the money is spent. And I think fundamentally, it's extremely hard for government to spend that money well. I applaud your idealism in saying we just need to make them spend it better. I think that's a challenge that may be too hard to conquer.
I hear you. I'm happy to agree to disagree on that one.
Okay. My guest today has been Paul Tough. Paul, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you so much. It was a great conversation.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.